Before we get started, I'd just like to take a moment to once again thank all of our sponsors. I'm not going to read that list all over again, but without their sponsorship and without their partnership, this would have not been possible. You know who you are? All right. Thank you very much. Wow, that was quick. My only fan, Paul McKinnon. All right, let's get it started. I had the privilege of sitting at the Smart Cities Challenge jury over the past year and a half. It's a federal program for the smart cities. There were 4 prizes, $50 million, $10 million, $10 million, and $5 million. It was the first time that Government of Canada was running something like this, but we've had similar challenges around the world. But I found being a part of the one in Canada quite exciting. First of all, the jury was very, very diverse. I'm a newcomer myself, and we had from age back, in terms of diversity, we had all kinds of backgrounds: the indigenous, the newcomers, the young, the old, the architects, the planners, the engineers. It was quite an interesting process to be a part of. I'm very excited to see Alex Long with Infrastructure Canada here. They did a tremendous job running this program. And it's really inspired me to bring some of that conversation back to Halifax and talk about what it means to build a smart city. Why should we even think about smart cities? Benji and I had a chat yesterday as we were walking. He said, "I hate the term smart cities." I'm going to ask you about that. But the reality is it's inevitable. It's a term that's getting used often now. We have to address it. We can no longer sit idle. We need to understand different aspects of it, especially that there are so many different interests that are coming in. I'm really excited about the fact that Bridgewater was one of the winners of Smart Cities Challenge. Who knew about that? Did you guys know that Bridgewater won $5 million? Yes. All right. Great. Yeah. And also we had Fredericton was one of the finalists. There were 130 applications. We narrowed them down to 20, and out of the 20, 4 winners. But all 130 had a lot of good information about what it means to design a smart city. So with that introduction, I'd like to introduce our first presentation. We're going to have Bridgewater, and we are going to have Fredericton talking about their experiences of smart cities. If we can go to the slide for Leon. I'd like to introduce Leon DeVred, another fellow Nova Scotian by choice. He's from Amsterdam, or Netherlands originally, and he is in charge of sustainability at Town of Bridgewater. He was also in charge of the Smart Cities Challenge that led to their win. I'd like to invite you to this podium.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's a real honor and a privilege, and I still shake my head almost daily that we're even in this position of being one of Canada's communities that's able to showcase its work nationally on a pretty public stage with regard to the Smart Cities initiative. And just as a way of starting, I especially shake my head at this because I don't even own a cell phone, and so I really am. I think I'm a technology skeptic, and perhaps maybe not in spite of, but perhaps because of a little bit of that, we are where we are today. Because I think that there are a lot of cautionary tales out there about smart cities and improper use of technology, and I'll draw a little bit on that in my presentation today. But I also wanted to acknowledge that I came to last year's Art of City Building conference, and I was deeply inspired by the things that I heard at the Smart Cities panel here last year, and we were finalists at the time. And Bianca Wiley, who has spoken so eloquently around the challenges of poorly done smart cities initiatives, were extremely inspirational to my team and I think influenced a lot of our design. So there's a little circularity, and I'm also deeply honored to be here for that reason. So Bridgewater's entire initiative is around reducing energy poverty. And that is the deep need that our Smart Cities initiative is trying to address. We were, I think, quite marvelously surprised to win the Smart Cities Challenge in the small communities category. And we're going to try to work hard to do that justice. The background of our work stems from really about a decade of work in creating a framework for energy transition for small and rural communities. That's actually where our work came from. And we wrote an energy transition plan that was published in 2018, and that really was the basis for our Smart Cities work. And in a nutshell, it's around shifting the entire community's energy system from what we have today to one that's low carbon in the future, and over about a 30-year period. So this is actually what we were working on. And one of the things that popped out at us during that process is the whole economics of energy. And Bridgewater only has 8,500 inhabitants, and yet we spend $88 million a year on energy as a community, which is kind of a mind-blowing number for a small Atlantic Canadian town. And so we started asking ourselves a lot of questions around whose pocket is that coming out of? And the reality is it's coming out of the pockets of people who don't have that money to spend. We in Atlantic Canada have some of Canada's oldest housing stock. There are still lots of homes in my community that have zero insulation in the walls. And we have a terrible situation in Atlantic Canada generally with housing. It's in need of significant renewal. And our plan doesn't only look at housing, it also looks at transportation energy. But we're incredibly dependent on fossil fuels as small, spread out, rural Atlantic Canadian communities. We're also really dependent on those fossil fuels to bring us the goods and services that we rely on, and when hurricanes come through, we realize just how reliant we are on those fuels. We're also living in a context of rapidly rising energy costs. There's been a 90% increase in the price of electricity just in the last 15 to 20 years. That has really been felt in our communities and is part of this whole equation. So here's the number that blew our minds when we dug into the energy plan. The average household, the average family in my community spends $6,500 a year on energy for home and transportation. When you consider that the median income in our town for a household unit is $45,000, that's a lot of money. And that really was what raised our awareness of the problem of energy poverty, which first started out as kind of an academic exercise, but it very quickly became personal. So while we suspected that energy poverty was something that was a real issue and need in our community, becoming a Smart Cities finalist enabled us through a finalist grant that all 20 finalist communities received from the federal government to really dig into this topic very deeply. And we discovered that 2 out of 5 residents experience difficulty on a chronic or a periodic basis affording energy for home and transportation. And that's enormous. But it's not just the statistics, it's the stories we collected that were also incredibly meaningful and moving and frankly heartbreaking. We interviewed dozens of residents and people who work with people experiencing poverty, and it was a really eye-opening experience for our entire team, as well as for the many community partners who came together to work on this common cause together. And we have a whole report full of stories like this. And the thing is that this is not just unique to Bridgewater, by the way. Energy poverty rates are around 40% across Atlantic Canada. That research has been triangulated from a number of sources now. We're just one of the communities that has really dug quite deeply into the topic. So, you know, I wanted to give you a little bit of background as to, like, what is the topic, what is the issue, because I think that's part of my point today, is that the issue really matters for Smart Cities initiatives. I don't think that Smart Cities initiative should be done with technology as the end. Technology should be the means. The question is, what is the end? And so, in the development of our proposal to create an energy poverty reduction program, you know, which has a lot of the classic characteristics of Smart Cities initiatives, you know, I don't have the time to explain to you the intricacies of that in my short presentation today. You can read on it. You can read it up on our website. It's a completely public plan. But the only part of it that I really wanted to show you is this one slide. And, you know, the little bits in the middle there are the different components of the program that work together to reduce energy poverty risk in our community. But the part that I really wanted to show is all the bits around the outside, because those are the outcomes that we're looking for from our program. And the main thing in thinking about what was the lesson that we learned in moving through our Smart Cities journey is that it's all about the outcomes. And if you can be really clear about what those outcomes are that you're trying to generate, that will be an important guiding light in making sure that you don't fall into a lot of the common pitfalls, I think, of Smart Cities initiative. And so those are also the yardsticks by which we are going to know and be held accountable to our residents and our community that's put a lot of faith into this process. And those are the ones also that will impact people's lives. What I perceive, being a relatively new practitioner in this field, is that we're at the beginning of what I think is a new wave of Smart Cities initiatives. And I think that the Smart Cities, the federal Smart Cities program had the foresight to put some really good ideas down as requirements for the Canadian Smart Cities initiative. And I think that they are helping to breed this new wave of initiatives that, first of all, are truly grounded in community issues. I think that that's going to be a real touchstone that, again, I'm coming back to over and over again. Have the values around being 100% community-led, designed, and stewarded, which I think is super important. And because those are two of the key touchstones, they open the initiatives up to approaches that work for small and rural communities, which is still the majority of Canadian, local governments, right? Like we're a country where there's a high concentration of people in the major cities, but we still have many, many municipalities that are in the similar boat as Bridgewater. We're fairly small. And that final touchstone there of technology as a means and not an end. So, the process that we went through, we did a little distilling around, what is it really, from a process perspective, that we did that is transferable to other communities. And basically, the way I tell it to myself is it's just problem solving. Using Smart Cities approaches is just making better use of data and information systems to make better outcomes for your community. That's all it really is. So, starting with deep problem definition, really understanding the issue, sinking into it, working with stakeholders and community members that understand the problem, through outcome definition, which is so critical and so often missed, through doing gap analysis and so on, and partner and asset mapping, and only then talking about solutions and looking very carefully at things like data privacy and governance, and how does the solution maintain community control over data, and not, something that ends up in a black box and sits in some corporations or some, bureaucrats' locked file somewhere or used for nefarious purposes. And then the main point I want to make with this slide is that the technology design comes at the end, right? it's the last thing that you do after you determine what it is that needs doing. And then, of course, it's an iterative process, and we're now going through a detailed round 2 of all of this. But that's really the main point I wanted to make there. And so, at the end of it, we created something fancy that looks like this, that I won't get into, and you can't read. But we're developing an energy management information system for our entire community. That's cool. That's a new idea, right? But look at what we've already seeded the project with. We've seeded it as an energy management information system that will be for the community, by the community, right? So that's really different. That's a new kind of thing, and that's why we're in this innovation space. And again, you can read up on that on our website. So just a couple of things that we learned from this process that I wanted to share with you today. And the first is that I think that smart cities approaches are really just modern interpretations of good problem solving. I also think that communities need to stay true to their desired outcomes and to the principle of maximizing the public good. I think that the Ramon's constant referral to how do we drive public good out of these arrangements with private sector partners. The project as a whole, the Smart Cities Initiative, needs to keep thinking about that. And then, of course, that the private sector can really provide incredible solutions, but only after governance and outcomes have been established. And that those are really the cornerstones of the project, and a community can continue to work with those, but shouldn't yield those in order to achieve the solution. The other thing that I wanted to say is that I think that smart cities approaches are incredibly relevant for local governments, regardless of their size. And we're in a really new space here. So a real question for me is what really do smart cities approaches and technologies look like for small and rural communities? That we're at a very new place with that. There's not a lot of examples out there yet, but they're emerging, and we're starting to see them. And when I look at our project, these are all the things that are already in the municipal wheelhouse. These are already matters that are totally relevant for municipal governments everywhere, and they are all connected through the technologies and the information systems that we're pulling together for our initiative. So it's really using existing jurisdiction and existing tools and systems, but enhancing them. And then lastly, just a couple thoughts again on the role for municipalities. Let's reclaim the wording, smart cities, as really just good problem solving. I'm a scientist by training, and I like to think of smart cities approaches as using scientific approaches to, but human design sort of influenced science in municipal government. The tools are here, so why don't we use them? They are here, they're wonderful, they're interesting, they deliver. We also think that it's a new opportunity for integrative thinking, because we're beginning to question. We can use it as a way to question assumptions and to question relationships and power structures and so on. And then the importance of ongoing evaluation, which is what the data tells you. If you use data well, it'll tell you whether you're making progress or not. And then finally, if we don't take charge of this conversation, if we don't take charge of this space and lay the ground rules for engagement, chances are the private sector will. And I think that that's an outcome that I'm not really sure that I want my community to experience. I'd rather be in control of that conversation space. So, in conclusion, the thing that I wanted to leave you with today as an inspiration is that I think that smart cities are an opportunity for public institutions, regardless of what part of government they work for, not just to build a better mousetrap or to get with the time or whatever, but it's actually an opportunity for creating transformational change, for sustainability, for equity, for prosperity. Let's make use of these tools, but let's do it with eyes wide open. Thank you. Thanks, Raj.
We'll have you at the panel soon. Thanks so much, Leon. No pressure, but the whole country is watching you guys. a lot of small communities out there, many applicants that were not successful are watching, and they're looking to learn. I have a lot of confidence in you guys based on everything you described here. It seems like you guys are talking about the democratization of the smart city process, which is very interesting. I'm going to introduce Laura Guthrie to come to the stage. She's the Economic Development Specialist, Smart City Project Manager with City of Fredericton. I'm just going to say a couple of things from behind the scenes. I'm not going to say too much, don't worry, Alex. The jury discussions the conversations were really interesting, and we really wish we had 20 prizes to give when it came to Smart Cities Challenge. We had to pick 4, but that doesn't take anything away from all the hard work that you guys did, especially on the public engagement piece and the indigenous piece. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from your presentation on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's my pleasure to be here today, and thank you, Kurush, for the invitation. I am the least technical person, I will say that, so I'm just assuming I hit the green button, that's it? Okay, thanks. First of all, I'm just going to give you some of the aspirations that kind of guided our whole Smart Cities Challenge, that we really thought about. Imagine a smart city where all residents feel recognized and to digital services and connected to the community 24/7 and on a very personal, interactive level. Imagine an accessible city where there are no barriers. The door is wirelessly open and you can find available wheelchair accessible parking. Imagine an inclusive city where no one is left behind and even our most vulnerable are digitally enabled and expedited on a path of sustainable living. Imagine a digital city where free Wi-Fi and open data fuels new startups, enabling residents to create networks of communities of interest and design solutions to address real community problems. And imagine a caring community where our nonprofit organizations in the community are actually connected to municipal and provincial data infrastructure, which could lead to better policy development and help to create more evidence-based decision-making to improve the lives of our residents. So these were some of the aspirations that really shaped our proposal and our 5 projects. I'm going to use my notes here. So Kurush already spoke about kind of the background with the Smart Cities Challenge. I did want to mention that we partnered with St. Mary's First Nation on our Smart Cities Challenge. It was a first for our communities in working together, and we are actually in it's a unique position. Only a few urban cities in Canada actually have a First Nations community within the heart of the city. The Maliseet community, Willistic Way, is one of only 6 communities actually existing on the planet. And we share history, we share the land, we share the river, the St. John River, which is known as the Willistic. So that was kind of the starting point of our challenge. We took a very collaborative approach. We involved over 42 people from various organizations, nonprofits, thought leaders, academics, and basically had the community come together and roll up their sleeve to be part of our task force and to bring our 5 projects to fruition. Through an extensive engagement process, which was mentioned before, we polled the community on issues and sought their ideas on what types of innovative data and technology solutions that could address our challenges. As a result, we developed our vision centered on empowerment and inclusion, and there were 6 buckets through Infrastructure Canada. So that is what we went out to the community and we sought their ideas. Our vision was Fredericton and St. Mary's are collaborating to create an accessible, welcoming, supportive community, starting with our most vulnerable. And in our community, that was older adults. It was the people who were experiencing homelessness. It was our youth, our newcomers, people who have accessibility limitations. Although we didn't win the challenge, I really feel that we're winners. We received $250,000 to advance 5 projects, and right now we're just in the process of right-sizing them. Resident engagement was the cornerstone of our challenge. Our approach, and I really wanted to talk about this today in a little bit more detail, was really deeply involving the residents and stakeholders in the design of our solutions, and that has been a common theme that various people have touched on today. And essentially really understanding what our residents' needs are and then connecting them to the services and resources to meet those needs. So I would say in the past, the municipalities took a very generalized approach to the customer. We developed projects, thought, oh, this is a great idea, and then you roll them out. But today, post-Cities Challenge, we're really precisely defining and recognizing who that customer is. And during the challenge, we focused on two segments, older adults and those with accessibility limitations. So the first part of this iterative process, which we developed during the challenge, was to recognize our residents. We used ethnography, so that was having really in-depth conversations, one-on-one conversations, say with older adults, and I'm going to talk about an example. But really gaining insights about what their needs and wants are. What are their pain points? What's preventing them from having a good day? We actually did some walkabouts with some of our citizens. We did a day in a life tour, which I'm going to show you in a short video in a little bit, where we actually strapped a GoPro to a young gentleman who was in a wheelchair and really experienced what his day is like and the barriers that he faces. We developed distinct empathy-based personas, and then we ideated on what kind of solutions could help address those challenges, and we developed 3 prototypes during our Smart Cities project. Finally, we tested our findings. We used traditional methods like using surveys, but the most interesting to me was learning the process of user-centered design, citizen co-creation, which has been talked about today. And it was a really interesting process because, you know, we have these ideas of what we think is great, but when you're sitting down with an actual citizen and looking at it through their eyes and getting them to interact with it and really confirm whether it's a good idea or testing your assumptions was extremely valuable. And then, of course, connecting them with what matters. This slide is an example of the ethnography research we did targeting older adults. And I won't get into the extreme detail, but we developed 3 personas at 3 different levels of older adulthood. And what we discovered during our research was a group of older ladies who established their own safety network. They didn't have children living close by, so they had this online Scrabble game. And every day, if one of them didn't check in at 9 o'clock in the morning, that was kind of the cue for someone to follow up and check on them. And it ended up being, it gives me goosebumps every time I tell this story because it ended up being life-saving because they found one of the ladies in a diabetic coma and she almost died. So using that problem and those insights, we developed a solution, a prototype that we called Check-in Companion. So, and that is on our website. So we have 5 projects. I'm just going to go through these quickly and then touch on one in particular. But Digital Fredericton was kind of the backbone of our Smart Cities Challenge, essentially transforming, modernizing government, switching everything from kind of the antiquated systems to cloud-hosted systems and platforms. And I'm told we're going to be the first municipality in Canada completely hosted in the cloud. So we've been rolling that out, and then based on created efficiencies, we're redeploying staff to more customer-facing roles. We're going through that whole iterative engagement model that I mentioned before for every customer segment. So it may take us a little bit longer now, but that is the plan go forward. And then lastly, the third layer, which I'm really excited about, is the connected community layer. So that's where we're engaging with our entrepreneurs and getting them to help us design solutions to address real problems and creating that living lab environment. Sorry, I'm a little behind with my slides. So Durable, we partnered with a young Indigenous entrepreneur. Her company is called Appdigenous, and basically her vision is to create a living lab for accessibility. And it really crystallizes what we're trying to do with that connected community layer. She is developing a solution that will help persons with accessibility and mobility limitations. And she has designed a prototype. We're piloting it at 6 sites in the city right now, but it wirelessly opens doors. And it has a whole data analytics layer. So we're going to use that information to help inform, maybe infrastructure upgrades and, municipal decision making. And I just want to really show you a quick video here. Thank you so much, Krish, for uploading that. What do I do? Oh. Do you know what Oh, the video's not there? Okay. Anyway, it's on our website. It's just a really short video, but it's the young guy that I was talking about in the wheelchair. And it just really, really drives home what we just don't understand about the barriers that people face. So the road home was another example of connecting a vulnerable segment of our population, those who are chronically and episodically homeless, with what matters. We rolled out during the challenge a shared case management platform connecting all the homeless serving agencies. So essentially, it's reducing redundancies in the system. It's helping to improve clients' quality of life. They're not having to retell their story every time they go into a different service agency, which is what was happening. It's reducing wait times, and it's also enabling data collection so that we really can show that evidence-based value that these agencies are providing to our communities. So the Nonprofit Data Collaboration Project, I mentioned that briefly before when I was talking about the vision, but the NPOs are not connected to provincial municipal data infrastructure. So the vision with this project was really to lead to, help influence policy development, identify gaps. We've put this project on the back burner for now, but we're hoping at some point that we can pursue it somehow. And the Digital Community Hub, that was our primary project to connect residents with what they need on a personal level. We developed a prototype. It's on our website as well, using that ethnography research and the user-centered design. We focused on persons with accessibility limitations and older adults. So have a look at it. But we really felt that the whole idea was that based on what your needs were, you would go in and then basically it would curate a menu, a list of resources, tools, and information that you would need maybe on a personal level. So it was an interesting project. So finally, lessons learned. And I'll just kind of talk briefly about these, but I think the main point I wanted to hit home was collaboration, that it's not something that you can do alone. And I think that was the essential ingredient in our success with the Smart Cities Challenge, was just bringing everybody together. The opportunity for First Nations partnerships. This was kind of a first project. We had the first joint meeting of our councils. We're working towards a friendship accord. St. Mary's First Nations is just brimming with lots of young entrepreneurs with great ideas, so there will be more to come. Of course, having a really clear vision, charting our course, but digging deep with the public engagement. That was absolutely critical, and truly representing the voice of the citizenry and being able to create public value around what they are looking for, and that citizen-centric approach, because I really realized going through the process of the challenge that we have so many assumptions. You don't even realize sometimes the assumptions you make, and it really forced us to really see things, kind of turn the triangle upside down. So the citizen coming first, seeing it through the citizen lens, and then going through testing and refining, and that it's okay to make mistakes and that you can go sideways. Whereas in the past, we were just looking for, kind of the shortest, most efficient way to maybe create a program or a new service and roll it out. Protecting data and privacy, I learned, is a really highly complex business, and I realized how much we really didn't know going through and developing a preliminary privacy impact assessment. I'm sure Leon can understand. Anyways, we learned a lot through that process, and that will carry us forward in the future. And then finally, what it means to be a smart city and finding new ways to enable civic innovation. And since the Smart Cities Challenge, that's been something I've really been focused on of what we can do as a municipality, working more with our citizens, with our entrepreneurs, giving them an access point to be able to come in. We've deployed a LoRaWAN network using Internet of Things, IoT network sensors. We've been doing lots of use cases and testing and hackathons and bringing the community in. So for us, it's all about that citizen co-creation, and we'll be continuing on that path. So anyways, thank you very much. Oh, we've got the video ready now.
My name is Melissa Lunny. I'm the founder of AppDigenous. AppDigenous is an app company, and we make accessible apps.
People say that before they met me, they didn't even realize how hard it is for somebody in a wheelchair to get around.
I noticed a lot of these things are kind of quick to change.
Yeah, there's been times when I'm like, I don't know if I'm going to make it in the 15 seconds or not.
Starting this project, I've learned of a lot of problems with accessible doors and buttons. The button can be out of reach or in a really weird position that's kind of awkward to actually hit and enter the building. They don't really stay open for a long enough time, and that can actually injure someone if they get hit with it. Oftentimes a building will only have one, and you might have to go around a whole block to find that one accessible door. Getting that first door open will be a big deal, hopefully life-changing for the people that are going to be using it.
Thank you very much for that. That was very inspiring. It's my pleasure to introduce Janelle Sobey. A couple of weeks ago, maybe 4 weeks ago, we were talking about really techie stuff that was going way over my head. Janelle was telling me about all these things about apps and development and this and that. I asked her a question about community development, and then I realized how tuned in she is to the ideas of placemaking, city building. But on top of that, she's really well versed to talk about technology. So I'm really excited for you to be talking about these two components. Thank you.
Thank you, Crash. It was really interesting listening to my fellow panelists. I didn't realize how well aligned we would be, considering we hadn't actually had a conversation about smart cities. And what I'm going to talk a little bit about today, as shaping it up through the lens of maybe a technologist, is some of the words I picked up in the other presentations, which is around this new wave of how we're redefining what it means to be a smart city and how we're using technology as a tool. So a little bit about myself, just to help anchor the lens and the approach that I'm taking to this. I have two technology companies. One's a services-based one, and the other one is an impact investing platform that collects and manages data for impact investments. And then also my background is a little bit eclectic. So I'm formally trained in social innovation, have experience in my work background, social innovation. I studied governance and policy structures and would have considered myself at one point a policy wonk. And then, of course, I have the two technology companies now. And so the approach that I'm taking to the conversation today, or looking at smart cities, is definitely one that sits at the intersection of those three areas of expertise. And so I started thinking, and when Crash invited me to speak, I didn't see it as an obvious fit right away because I'm not an urban planner. But I did start to think about, how we've defined traditionally what it means for a city to be smart. And the things that we think about are Internet of Things, smart grid technology, energy efficiency, mobility, access to Wi-Fi across the city. And as I started thinking through those things, I thought about a book I had read called Oryx and Crake, the first book of a trilogy of a series of Margaret Atwood books. Has anyone read Oryx and Crake? Okay, a few of you. So you're probably thinking, okay, why is she talking about Oryx and Crake? It's definitely futuristic, and I'll leave the narrative aside. But if you're, as the reader, paying attention to the backdrop of which the novel is telling a story alongside, is you end up with exactly the type of cities that you envision as futuristic. You see cities that are interconnected. There's high connectivity using technology. There's automation. There's efficiencies of service deliveries. There's flying cars. But what's also highlighted within the novels, when there's been advances within technology and sciences, is that there was also environmental ruin, and there was mass poverty, and new class structures were created. Now, I'm by no means saying that if we focus on just advances within technology for technology's sake, that that's where we'll end up. But it does raise the question of how we think about our cities and the cities that we live in. And so I'd like to challenge us today and on the panel to think about, how do we define smart cities? Rather think about how we build cities of the future that are smart, and how we define our cities of the future as smart will become critical to building successful futuristic cities. So, how do we define then what becomes smart future cities? And if I look at that cross-section of experience, the few things that I can pull out on, and I did hear it from the other panelists, is using an approach of human-centered design. And so at the core of being able to design really great services, technology, or policy is always ensuring that the end user is at the forefront, but also that it's human focused, that those services and the technology is being delivered and developed by and for those individuals. And the way that one of the really neat features of human-centered design is this idea around observation. And so, traditionally how we've collected information from citizenry has been on consultation and town halls and interviews, and there will be a subset of people who show up and who want to give voice to whatever the issue is that's being questioned or raised. But within human-centered design, there is this one piece of methodology that's quite special around observation. And so the idea is that not only do you employ empathy and put yourself into a specific user's journey or their own shoes, but rather that you put yourself in positions where you can observe individuals who are struggling with a particular challenge with the lens of looking at potential solutions. It's also governed by this idea of the 80-20 law. So you spend 80% of your time understanding the problem, getting really well versed in the problem that you're trying to solve, and the 20% remaining focused on what that solution will be. The other thing around this idea of product development and using human-centered design is also, at the end, your solution, it may or may not be technical in nature, but it likely can be enabled or scaled or accelerated if you can employ technology, and not in every instance. But what we do want to make sure that we avoid is that we're just building cool features within our cities because it's a neat thing to do. And so when we're using human-centered design and that approach, it means that what's actually going to end up happening is if we're focusing on the people and this very specific problems of those people in those communities, that every smart city is going to look different. And every community is going to come up with new ways by which they can employ technology to address some of those challenges. So example, 15 to 20 years ago, when Estonia was rebuilding their community and they were behind, they thought, how are we going to catch up? And their solution was to leapfrog. And so they said, great, we are going to digitize all of our governance services and infrastructure. And that's how Estonia solved the problem of being behind. In Japan, as another example, the people problem that they were focused on was that they had really high suicide rates in their undergrounds. And so the technology or the solution that they decided to employ was the blue light. And so now there's the blue light in some of their undergrounds, and it's reduced the number of suicides of individuals who have jumped onto the tracks. So those are people-focused solutions that are enabled by technology, and they're not all going to be the same for every community or every city. And so that's the second point that I wanted to highlight, is that we're not going to be able to implement solutions in one city and be able to always pick them up and that they fit another city. And arguably, that would be the case for the segments within our society. As we're building very specific solutions for end users, our end users are going to have different needs. And what that means is, we may be building different services or tools for different segments of the population, and that's okay. We don't need to be building necessarily services that meet the average where they're at, because according to this room, if this was the average, it's certainly not representative of the types of services that are needed in our community. So I think really just, it's about getting comfortable with building for outliers and extreme cases and recognizing that those will be the case, and they have to be part of how we build smart societies going forward. And then the other thing that I did want to touch on is just this concept around long term. So as we build smart cities, we talk about technology as it's really fast and it accelerates and it's happening at a faster pace, and all of that is true. And that's the role that governments and citizens play through the policy making. And just ensuring that as we build our cities for the future, that it's coming from a place of vision, and that vision has the collective experience in it with a long-term benefit and gain. Because oftentimes the solutions that we'll build, you can do a really quick cost-benefit analysis on it, and if the payoff isn't immediate, at some times, and this is where I know on the panel we'll talk about the tension between public-private sector leadership within this space, but oftentimes this is where private sector may not be able to lead. The public sector would definitely have a longer term vision, and there's not always going to be the immediate quick trade-offs or even economic or people impact immediately. So just making sure that we're thinking about the investments that we make long term. They are expensive investments. It does require infrastructure, and that cost benefit analysis might not prove valuable from an economic standpoint for 10 years from now. And so simply in closing, before I join my other panelists, smart cities of the future will be defined by connected communities that are efficient in solving problems and in the service delivery. Technology is not the solution, rather it is the tool that will enable the solutions for our cities in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janelle. I'm going to invite the speakers to just join us for a panel, as well as Benji and Tim, and Ramon is going to help me moderate the session. We're going to show a short video from Smart Cities Challenge in San Francisco that Tim asked us to show. Can you cue that?
San Francisco is one of the most transportation-rich cities in the country, but we've got some immense issues and challenges. We've got the great land use, we've got the great street design, and people are coming and using transit, but it's overwhelmed. At the same time, the people that are driving are finding it really hard to get around the city. Too many people are getting hit by cars and they're getting killed. We also have a population of our city that can't afford to get around, or they physically are not able to get around.
Everybody can benefit from increased mobility, reduced travel times, and reduced costs. That time in travel is time that people aren't spending with their families, or they're not spending at their jobs.
In 2000, I had a stroke. This is what put me in the wheelchair. This is my car. This is my baby. I'm not a sit-at-home type person. I'm out most of the time, constantly doing something.
No one solution is going to help make our city smarter. We can't focus on one corridor or one street. Our Smart City Challenge proposal is really one that we think is holistic. We're focusing on smaller pilots across the region, the city, and particular neighborhoods. From an integrated mobility app that can allow you to route, book, and pay, to collision avoidance technology on our largest vehicles, free Wi-Fi in the neighborhoods, improving bike sharing, car sharing, and electric vehicle charging access in the neighborhoods. Having a street with 5 lanes of traffic is actually not helpful to anybody. We're trying to rebalance our streets for people who are walking, cycling, taking transit, and sharing.
So if we can figure out a way to get people around in higher occupant vehicles, you can fill gaps in the transportation network. You can provide services where we're not currently providing services.
And we reduce the need for parking, which means we can start converting some of our parking structures into affordable housing. And then we're going to create a community challenge, and we're going to invite the neighborhoods to say, I'm ready for this. Neighbors will be able to reconnect with their neighborhood, shop locally, and really help reinvest their local dollars in their neighborhood.
My husband and I both decided to get rid of our cars. We've gotten this big old cargo bike with a little bit of electric motor to help us get up the hills. We've done a real good job of just taking advantage of what our neighborhood and what our city has to offer, and how we can just get everywhere we want without a car, and doing it that way.
This city is only 49 square miles, and every time a car goes down, you're contaminating your 49 square miles. So you need to get people out of cars and in some clean vehicles.
From the day the cable car was invented right here in San Francisco to today when we are hosting 12 companies that are testing autonomous vehicles, we are a leader in transportation technology.
And with some of the nation's top data analytics programs and researchers on our campus, the University of California, Berkeley can lend immense support in helping San Francisco meet the Smart City Challenge.
We have a society in our city baked in of early adopters who love to learn, test, and play new ideas. That's our culture. We have the ecosystem of all our providers, the strongest support network from our universities, and we have the ability with all of our different topographical neighborhoods in our city to really test this in different applications. We should be able to scale it from a neighborhood across the whole city to the rest of the cities around the country, and then ultimately around the world.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, Sam. Before we start the panel, just a quick note that all the smart city applications, all 130 of them, and the 20 finalists, all the information that was submitted is available online. If you just Google Smart Cities Canada Challenge, you should be able to find it all. There are a number of studies that are going on right now across the country by universities, because the smart city applications really tap into all the city building challenges that we're having. And the smart cities, just as Janelle was saying, it's just a way of approaching it differently and trying to make it, to try to find other solutions for it. With that, I'm going to start asking with Benji, why do you hate smart cities?
That term, let's just say. Okay.
Yes.
How much time are you giving me? Okay, number of reasons. One, it emerges from kind of this techno-optimist, techno-triumphalist, technology will solve your city. And for most of what we've seen, it's really just solutions looking for a problem. Now, let's be clear, this is actually not the first time that we tried to throw technology at cities. After the moonshot was successful, HUD in the US, the Housing and Urban Development Department, hired hundreds of scientists from NASA. And the whole intent was to bring computer analysis and algorithms to solve cities. One of the things they worked at, and RAND Corporation was one of these consultants, was to look at New York City's efficiency in delivering fire relief. And RAND developed an algorithm, it's a smart algorithm that said, you can reduce the number of fire stations you have across the city by 30% through this algorithm. What they didn't account for, of course, was local politics. So guess where they took most of the fire stations out from? Harlem. What happened after they took out the fire stations in Harlem? The Fires in Harlem. There's a really good book, After the Fires by Joe Flood, that showed exactly this techno, we're going to solve it without understanding human relationships. So that's not the first time. Even the modernist idea of technology and efficiency solving the city has created more problems. Now, given that, right, given also that, over a decade ago, we were looking at the smart cities language, which IBM started, and it was really a marketing campaign around 2008 when the economy was tanking and they were looking at who is our next set of clients. Guess who has money? Municipalities, because they still have taxes. And so we're going to sell them, and so this new thing is called smart cities. It was successful. It was picked up by nearly everyone else. And Cisco had its own definition of smart cities. Now IBM doesn't use it, but it was this whole, the assumption that their cities are dumb. There's a whole civic tech movement that said, we're going to solve cities. Never worked in cities, so they hadn't figured out. I remember a conversation with an IBM senior scientist. They were putting together a conference on cities. And we were talking, it was me, it was Nicholas Dimenshaw, it was Anthony Townsend, and it was a pre-conference conversation. And the senior scientist, very, very smart guy, I respect him totally, said, we were talking, the question that Nick Dimenshaw asked was, well, the question is really who is the Jane Jacobs of city technology? And in the middle of the conversation, the senior scientist says, excuse me, but who's Jane Jacobs? Which was like, well, you can't go trying to solve cities if you haven't read about cities just yet. So I loved Leon's presentation because that's exactly what we need to. We need to start with what is the problem you're trying to solve and figure out what is it that we're trying to answer. And then technology comes to be a tool. Not the whole, well, what doodad can we buy and what can I sell you? That then, therefore, then you can now say you're a smart city because you have 100 different sensors which sit in some database that you can't figure out, and it's probably making things worse because you now have more data of data that you don't need.
May I?
Long response.
No, to develop further in this conversation, I think we pretty much agree here, so we can just keep talking about that. But I still have the feeling that the conversation, it's a bit tricky sometimes, no? Because when we are part of a smart city discussion of conference, normally we find activists and academics discussing the uneven effects of those technologies, the quality impacts and all these kind of factors. Then you find companies that they have pretty sophisticated products and they want to sell them, but most of them, they are already talking about technology as a mean and not as a goal. And then you have elected politicians that you can find them just flying a sensor, flying a drone, super amazed over the trade fire, and still just loving it so much. So my question is, why it's still happening that elected politicians love sensors so much, and what are we doing wrong?
I think it's that we're not doing anything wrong, is that most of our mayors are still old white men and they love shiny new things. So there's a little thread happening which we need to call out right now, so I'm going to use this time to platform. And I think it's important that, no one wants to live in a dumb city. No one wants to be a dumb city. And I think this smart city thing is a real challenge if it's not actually done properly. I think one of the things that was really eye-opening for us when we were kind of pushed into applying for the Smart City Challenge, and we debated for about 2 months whether or not we should actually even apply. We're the city of San Francisco, we're the tech darling, we're also the poster child of what's all wrong with technology, and we thought it was an opportunity to really bridge some of those issues together. But there was no way we're going to come from a techno-optimist perspective of we can actually do this. So instead, we engaged all of our community activists and leaders in the community and said, do you actually want us to even apply for this? And they said, hell yeah, apply for it, because there's things we can get for this. It's $50 million, blah, 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 blah. In the process, as we were meeting and working with all the different activist communities around there, and we put together this video, which was, I thought, really cheeky, because you're only allowed 3 minutes, so we spoke as fast as we could to get everything we wanted in there. It was a very different application. It was all about the community actually leading the process, the community deciding what they wanted in their neighborhoods, the community actually pushing within the tool frame that they gave us. And even the federal government said, this is not really what we were talking about. I was like, yeah, because we don't believe in what you were talking about. This is what we're talking about. This is what it is for us. So I think we even had conversations at the time where it was very tense, where I was meeting with different people and saying, excuse me, but using words like this is really tough when you're talking to your future funder. You need to check your privilege, right? Imagine having that conversation and say, you're not letting other people speak in the room. You're taking up all the airtime, and your airtime is over. So how do you have those fair conversations? It's happened a little bit today as well in the forum today. So we all need to just check ourselves a little bit, check our privilege, check our bias, check our assumptions, and speak a little less and listen a bit more. My mum always used to say to me, we've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. Listen twice as much as you speak, right? And it's really important because I'm actually the one who's speaking, but it's, right? But this is what I was asked a question for. Yeah, exactly. So it's I think it's important to understand that that's how you have to have a lot of these conversations anyway. That's it.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Is it on? I just wanted to add, when we were talking about devices and kind of the shiny new objects and whatnot, we're really cognizant of not getting caught up with that stuff. We're actually working on an early adopter program right now as part of our Civic Innovation Initiative, so that we really can be strategic and focused on what is going to help our residents and help our community. And when I mentioned the LoRaWAN before and the IoT devices, just want to really emphasize that we are focusing on community problems. We had devastating floods this past year, and we actually brought in people to help us. We used an IoT device, connected it to the network to be able to do real-time flood monitoring, which we pushed out through social media. So, it was a really cool application. We've actually deployed sensors in wheelchair accessible parking places around our community. And we haven't really launched that yet, but that's going to be as part of this whole Accessible City initiative, because we'll have the data, people are going to be able to know where they can find parking in real time. So just emphasizing that it is real problems, and we're getting the citizens involved in helping us design those solutions.
I'm going to ask you a question from Janelle. It's inevitable that technology companies are going to come to this environment. The cities they have money, as you said, Benji. The cities have problems that they need to solve, so technology companies are coming to this space, and it's inevitable. What's the role of big tech and small tech, like yourself, in the discussion around city building? Don't call it smart cities, but in solving problems in our cities.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with technology, right? We all love technology, and it is about how we employ it and utilize it as a tool. Honestly, I think it's about education. So it will also inevitably happen that as you're building a piece of technology, whether you're the big guys or the small, you have to know what your hypothesis is, what problem you're trying to solve, and what you believe that piece of technology is trying to solve. So even though you're coming at the problem and with two different perspectives and lenses, it's critical, I think, for the success of whatever that solution is, that it's one where both parties are educating each other on what the end goal needs to be, because both carry expertise, and for the most part, depending on what companies, you're working towards a common objective and goal as well. So I think it comes down to education on both sides.
So here's a crazy idea. How many Dalhousie or students in the room? Okay, you guys are going to take coding classes, and you're going to invite your technology friends to take planning courses. Good? All right, that problem is solved. You have a question for the panel?
I don't know, go in for the easy one or for the tough one?
Go for the tough one.
The
You don't
tough
have
one?
much time, tough ones.
We are calling those guys techno-optimists. And I'm wondering which is the opposite to that. Are we human pessimists? But I have the feeling that techno-optimism is it's fake optimism, because actually it's one of the, doing that is one of the most pessimist things that we can do as human beings, because we are just giving up on evolving, no? We are delegating our intelligence. We can be dumb because technology will solve the things. So if on the one hand we have techno-fake optimism, which is on the other side? Which is our term?
I'm now conscious of taking my privilege, being male, right? But if you'll indulge me, I think I'm going to flip that question, and what can we learn from the technology companies? And that we would really need in the way we run our cities, right? And you saw it in the presentations, is human-centered, user-centric design, which we in the policy world have forgotten. And we know how the systems are moving and how big pieces of the infrastructure are moving. We don't know the user experience. So this ethnographic approach could really, really change the way we both think about policy and write policy. Second, it's this culture of asking, can we do it better, which is really lean and agile, right? Of trying something and seeing what we can learn. In my own city's case, or at least my department's case, we're trying to build a culture of learning because the way we learn is we learn like a dog that gets kicked. So if you so we do something wrong and we say we'll never do that again, but we never ask which part of it are we not going to do again, right? It's just, no, it was such a bad experience. So we need to be able to learn, and that in the technology companies, and they had to go through this because it used to be waterfall software development until Agile came around. If we can take that in that culture, coupled with the commitment to focusing on the needs of the community, and saying let's be empirical, let's test it, let's try it again, and learn from it, then you could really empower governments even more and communities even more. So those are the two things. So it's not this, are you a techno-optimist or techno-fatalist or whatever else. It is, or techno-pessimist. It is that you know, is it Marsden who said, technology is neither good or bad, but it's not neutral. Right? And so you have to understand the side you're taking on first and what you want to use the tool for, and also the development in the history of that tool, I think.
I guess the person who worked at Google and at cities at the same time, it's like I have very strong opinions on this stuff, but I'm going to try and keep it brief. When I was at Google, one of the things that they would say all the time is that technology works best when it's in the background, not the foreground, which could be subversive if you think about it that way, right? So the challenge with technology when it's, because it is not neutral, is we know when it works and we know when it doesn't work. We all love Wi-Fi. That's probably the technology that we all could universally say is a good thing, generally. We hate apps and notifications. We know that that stuff drives us nuts, and it's actually designed by psychologists to cause a dopamine rush in our brain and constantly make us look at our phone. So if you want to actually have a quality of life, turn all your sounds off, turn all your notifications off. That's actually a way to get some freedom back from this thing that's attached to our hands. It's attached to my hand right now. So, you know, there are some of the things that we need to ask the question on. But then I think to your initial point, I think it was a really important thing to look at. There are third ways of doing these things. One of the reasons why we set up City Innovate was to create that third space where government and technology could actually work in a neutral third space and actually solve for real challenges, and not the IBM type stuff or the Microsoft stuff, but actually solve real challenges that were led for and designed by cities. And that meant communities, right? So there are real obstacles and challenges in the city. Putting those problems very cogently and succinctly together, and then sending them out to the startup community and saying, who is willing to actually help us solve these problems? That's a really win-win way of working with technology.
I'm going to ask a question from Leon before we open it up to the audience here. As a fellow planner, how do you write policies about smart cities? It's such a tough thing to do because technology is advancing so quickly, but we have to write policies to have planning documents and all of those things. How do you go about writing policies and bylaws that don't hinder the implementation of technology, but at the same time doesn't allow technology to reign and take over our city building?
Can I add a bit of this question to mix it? Because we see at the beginning there was just tech companies doing software. Then you started to do hardware, do two things together for cities. But they're actually now doing city building. And we have seen it with Amazon headquarters too, with Sidewalks Lab in Toronto. So how do we do policies facing those challenges as well?
I have no idea.
Yeah,
Thanks for laying out like the nice big, elephant trap for me there.
Sorry.
But I suspect, with some humility, that I think a lot of it comes down to trying to understand, what is the aim of the thing that we're trying to solve, right? Or what is the objective of the initiative? And I think the other question, and this is going back a little bit to the previous one around, what's the opposite of techno-optimism? I think it's a culture of bringing the right people into the room, right? In order to know that we're not going off on some fantasy journey, through tech land, and keeping it I think keeping it real is really important. And I know that myself and my team have been incredibly challenged on a personal level around checking our own assumptions, because we're working with, in our initiative, we're working with an incredibly wide spectrum of people who are basically underserved in our community through a variety of mostly structural reasons, right? And so there's a tremendous amount of, learning that we have to do to understand our solution space. And I think that in continuously inviting those voices into the room and being very humble in our development of policy, if perhaps we can start with that view.
And I think if I can add something, Frith put something up that was really inspiring to me. Walk backwards into the future. That was really inspiring, and I think that really applies to this. And it goes exactly against what Facebook's motto was, move fast and break things. And I think this is exactly like making sure that as we are moving towards the future, we are looking backwards. I'm going to open it up to the floor, either comments or questions. We have 10 more minutes. Go ahead.
I'd really settle for a smartish government. I'd rather settle for a smartish government of people and let the technology come quite a bit later. I mean, I've been involved for computers for more than 50 years. They were fun toys to play with in university. I was doing punch cards. I mean, that's how far back we go. I love my iPhone. I hate my iPhone. We just demonstrated with the hurricane here how susceptible a smart city could be if the power fails in all the cell towers. You know, parts of Nova Scotia are still not 100% recovered. Technology poses real risks, and I think a risk-benefit analysis must be done before you turn over major chunks of our environment. No question. Comment.
Yes. Can you hear from some of the young students here that are going to be doing what we're doing in a couple of years? What are your thoughts on smart cities, policy, and technology? You guys are Generation Z for the most part, and you will be, I don't know, we're hoping that you're going to save us. What are your comments about smart cities and the intersection of technology and cities?
Can I ask a question? Okay. Yeah, so I guess this is for some of the like smart city finalists or winners, and also for Benji and Tim. But I guess do any of you have any examples of like cool examples or cool stories about the use of technology as a as like a public engagement tool? And I'm thinking like, how can we engage technology maybe in public spaces, or like we're in a library right now, which is, you know, creates a lot of access to technology that people don't always have access to. And I think in engagement we use a lot of like apps or online surveys, which assumes connections to internet and access to a computer or a smartphone. So I just want to know if you have any examples of like bringing technology to where the people are actually at in order to do engagement.
I'll give you an example of during phase 1 of our challenge that we wanted to engage like all the community, all different demographics, and we were thinking about the youth. And we actually had a young entrepreneur design an app to interact with the students. So kind of that, you know, middle school, high school, and we promoted it because we wanted to hear their voice. We wanted to understand how they envisioned a smart community. So, yeah, so I think it was a little bit outside of the box for government, you know, getting an app designed and going out to the schools and convincing the schools actually to let us get this distributed too was interesting. But, yeah, we really tried to get out and face-to-face with people. We did the traditional forms of engagement too, but, yeah.
We, in our Smart Cities initiative, we used a really wonderful emerging technology to reach every single resident in our community. We were literally able to pinpoint every single home in the community, and it was a paper survey. It worked really, really well.
Yeah, please.
One of the things we found when I was working in the city was creating challenges or competitions. People love to play games, like different games, almost like working, like community A versus community B, who has the most people crossing at a crosswalk, who has the most person riding bicycles. We made it like a game, and then we figured out what the gifts were. We had no idea what the gifts were at the beginning because we're a city, we have no money on this sort of stuff. But then we worked with the private sector, and they did a whole bunch of stuff, which was really fun.
In the back there.
I have a question for the the apps that you designed with the city of Fredericton, because you were working with like a First Nations community, how did you address language when you were developing apps and stuff like that? Because that was one thing that I had attended a session for the Smart Cities Challenge when in Halifax, and the Smart Cities initiative for Halifax was food insecurity and how we should address that in Halifax. And one of the comments that came up was addressing language when we're building apps and innovating and creating, different technologies. So did you see that as like an issue, or did you address that at all?
I would say we touched on it. Our chief, Pulchis, really articulated the importance of language as part of their identity, and I learned a lot going through the challenge, and that the importance of storytelling was spoken about earlier, and how they're passing that on in the First Nations community. And we reached out to the universities, and one of their, I forget her name, but one of the elders in residence, that was kind of her specialty. So we did a little bit of consulting and learning, educating ourselves and understanding that that would be part of the, moving forward if we did win, but we didn't go deep on it.
Hi there. So just coming from Toronto for the last few years, you guys have mentioned the Google Sidewalk Labs being kind of a topic of discussion lately. So my question is, how do we hold accountability to urban development plans, sold to us, guised as us as smart cities, but are built on these foundations of these techno-utopic philosophies, and ensure that the municipal sphere remains for the people and by the people? It appears that development of cities being given to the private sector is really intensified by this action and this initiative, as evident, for example, in Toronto by conification is what I call it.
And then I'm going to hook it back to placemaking, right? The thing that technology has done is it's given us this very narrow bandwidth that we think is engagement, right? That you look at your feed or your likes and you think you have a community. But mostly you're performing. Mostly that's it. And you're just liking other people's performances. And the reason we need to get back into spaces and places is the broad bandwidth of human interaction that is necessary for us to be part of community. Where we not... The difference is if you're on Facebook or any other social media and you have a contrary opinion and you voice it, you're sure about the people who will... There will be people who will pipe up and attack you for it. The like is not enough, a powerful incentive as it is when you're in a room and you're disagreeing with someone and there are people in the room nodding with you who may not be raising their heads, but your wide bandwidth human interaction allows you to take that in. So what the problem that technology does is it narrows up the bandwidth and pretends that we have community. What we need to solve it with is real community. I'm so fascinated by what's happening in Hong Kong, where you see the scenes of the Hong Kong protesters tearing down the sensors and the cameras that are face readers, right? So here's the smart city. They're tearing it down because it's surveillance. They're using technology, which is meshed networking, so that they can communicate across with each other without having to go through the central cell phone networks. It's subverting, it's still technology, it's subverting the use it was created for. They were using dating apps to communicate with each other. So that because the government was monitoring surveillance, social media, it didn't realize that there were things going on in the dating apps. So what is interesting is stay away from the package solution, which was what the modern city was, right? I will solve your problem city by separating uses and creating highways, and here's a car. We released a new mobility playbook 2 years ago, and our primary stand was, we don't know what technology is going to come in terms of transportation, but we know what kind of city we want. And so we work on what kind of city we want, and then the technology has to adapt. It cannot be the other way around, where the technology presents a whole solution, and all you are is a passive participant of whatever it is they're serving you. I remember, again, going back to IBM, I'm sorry, my friends from IBM, we were showing counter graphs of what they thought the city was. They had a triangle, which was water, power, infrastructure as systems of systems, and dotted line, people as customers. People were customers of the city. The graphic we had was all these various transactional and network relationships of markets and who gets to decide what, and in the middle of it was the built environment that emerges because of the wealth of these networks and relationships. So long answer to your question is, as long as the technology and the face that's being given is something that is for us to use, not something that serves us and then we don't know the goals behind it. That's, I think, is what that would, a city is smart if the citizens are smart.
A little bit, maybe just approaching the answer a little bit differently, is looking at positions of power and influence. And so when you look at, how do we hold big tech companies accountable or protect citizens? I think governments going in with more confidence, knowing that they do represent the voice of people and therefore control the decisions and how the technology is utilized is important. And so, both governments and tech companies hold different types of power and influence. And I'm not suggesting it's by any means of negotiation, but government could be going in a much more confident manner as we try to understand how we best utilize technology for our cities.
I think the example is to look at cities that have what you would consider really nice things, right? Many people would always ask us, other cities around the country would say, why does San Francisco get to ask developers to do this laundry list long of stuff? Because we have a sense of place. We know who we are, we know what we want, we know what we can get from them. You may call it extortion, we call it negotiation tactics and betterments, right? But San Francisco can ask those things because we have a history and a culture of being really bold and meeting the stuff right in the eye and saying, you know what, this is who we are. You want to play with us? Come on, but you have to come with our rules. And not every city has that strength of place, that strength of community to be that strong. And I found in my work, which is dozens around the world, the ones that don't have that tend to be given things versus asking for things. Right, and you want to ask for things, and that's one of the big differences.
I'll just add a small comment. That actually is a good launching off point, I think, to talk about what is Atlantic Canada's nature, typically in interacting with big companies and with private sector. And we have a long and sordid history of boom-bust cycles triggered by resource exploitation. What we have to be very careful that we don't become in Atlantic Canada is the next resource to be exploited, in this big tech info world. And I think that the way that we do that is exactly by, what is being said here today, which is to be firm on what it is that's right for our communities and not to take on a poverty mentality and say this big, amazing, shiny object is being offered, we have to jump at it. The moral thing to do is to jump at it because it's resources coming in. We have to get away from that as a society.
Thank you. We're going to give the closing comment to Fred Kent, or question, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure what it is, but it's whatever it is. Detroit, it's the gold standard of transformation of a city in a very short period of time. And the term that they borrowed from us, and we all are using it, is lighter, quicker, cheaper. So I talked to them and I said, well, what kind of data do you collect? And they said, well, we use something we call visual flight rules, VFR, meaning when we see people using that, we know we're right, morning, noon, and night, and we go on to the next space. Because we're doing lighter, quicker, cheaper, we don't, there's all this data stuff. We can actually make changes quickly, and sure, we could get data on that, but the data is right there in front of our eyes. So place governance or shared governance in a way you could call it that, but it's still all about that place and that community and how that community will utilize that place in a positive way. And by doing that all around the downtown, and we did it in the neighborhoods and we did it along the waterfront, they have become a city defined by people in that city for what they would like to do and become. Does that fall into any of your data? I mean, Benji, I think that's sort of what you're saying, is that you can get an awful lot faster just by going and doing.
If I can just interject here, apologies. Let's take this conversation. We have a reception at 5 p.m. Paul McKinnon has promised us that there's enough time for everyone to do Q&As and continue this conversation. The library staff are being very patient with us. We are 20 minutes over time. Thank you very much. We're going to make sure that we get out of here very quickly. But with that, that's a good leading question for Paul to start the evening. 5 p.m. at the Brewery Market. We're going to have food, beer, more conversations. Please do come. The conference is not finished yet. Thank you.